We're seeing a little bit more of a complex picture there. That said, President Putin hasn't come to the negotiating table on a ceasefire thus far because he does not assess President Trump's threats to be credible. He does not believe that Trump wants to confront Russia or sort of fundamentally penalize it with any kind of real teeth.
Look, every Monday at this time we talk through the big foreign policy, diplomatic and defence stories of the week. And Sophia Gaston is a senior research fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and she joins me now. Sophia, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being with us. Let's start with Gaza, the diplomatic efforts and tensions that are happening over that war, and whether we're likely to see any change in the coming days. Look, here's the US President Donald Trump speaking yesterday. He was asked whether he sees any sign of a genocide taking place in Gaza.
I don't think it's that. Look, they're in a war. Some horrible things happened on October 7th, as you know. It was a horrible, horrible thing. One of the worst I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of bad things since some president in terms of wars and potential wars. I mean, if you look at the one that we just stopped, they had thousands of people being dead already at the border between Thailand and Cambodia. Thousands of people. And I mean, I've seen some bad things, but that October 7th was with Hamas was really, really bad.
That was Donald Trump speaking yesterday. Sophia, first up, were there thousands of people dead at the border between Cambodia and Thailand? I thought it was like in the sort of low tens.
Yeah, it certainly wasn't that high, but it did have the potential to be quite serious. And I think obviously President Trump is very happy to claim a victory here because he obviously came into his role re-elected, claiming that he would be sort of a president presiding over peace, and he's very keen to chalk up as many wins as possible because the conflicts he said he was going to be able to end quickly, namely Ukraine and in the Middle East, have proven a bit trickier.
A bit, yeah, indeed. We'll talk about Ukraine in just a moment. And look, speaking of somebody who was actually in Cambodia while that war was happening, I am indeed grateful to Donald Trump if he ended it, because otherwise I'm pretty sure I'd still be there, not least because I had to fly back via Thailand. Never mind all that. Let's talk about Gaza, Sophia. Look, we've seen in the last week lots of increasing pressure on the Netanyahu government from European governments, particularly Keir Starmer talking about the potential of recognising a Palestinian state, France going further, and so on. The upshot, though, seems to be, though, as long as Benjamin Netanyahu has American support, none of this is really going to make much difference to how Israel is behaving in Gaza at all, is it?
Well, these diplomatic interventions were designed to put a lot of pressure on the Israeli government. The problem is they haven't actually changed the fundamentals on the ground, namely that the hostages are still being held in captivity by Hamas. And obviously over the weekend, we saw release some really distressing images of their current state. We also, it's quite clear that Hamas doesn't have any short-term intention to disarm. And I think those are the two real sticking points for the Israeli government, which is why, I do think that in the short term, one of the consequences of these interventions is actually really both sides just sort of doubling down a little bit more. But I do think, that it is quite clear. I mean, if you read any Israeli media, the reports coming out, it's quite clear that there's still very profound divisions within Israeli society, and certainly some of the groups that represent the hostage families are very uncomfortable about these reports that there might be a new offensive into Gaza.
Yeah, indeed. And look, I mean, when Keir Starmer talks about Israel and Gaza, when European governments do generally, it's always with an assumption that the desired end goal is a two-state solution. Donald Trump doesn't seem to be committed to a two-state solution. He hasn't really said that, has he? Are we seeing a real political difference emerging over the Middle East between America and some of its allies?
I think so. It does seem as though the Trump administration has been moving away from that language, and it's unclear as to whether that's because they're not comfortable with a two-state solution or because they believe that it is impossible to achieve and therefore don't want to kind of put it out there as their stated goal. I think it's also clear that while Netanyahu's in power, that concept is becoming, less central to the narratives around the future prospects for Gaza. Gaza. And I think it's quite clear. I mean, we do have to remember that obviously October 7th was such a profoundly traumatic event that has changed Israeli society and its political system forever. And I think some of the ideas, I mean, we've been talking about two-state solutions for decades. It has challenged that paradigm because I think it has really made people feel that it does feel as though the concept of a kind of Hamas-free Palestinian state feels even further away. And so there's no clear, obvious pathway to that being achieved at the moment. And so again, we have to sort of wonder what the intention is by, the British, French, Canadian, and other governments in trying to push for this, because, there's quite a few steps that would need to take place to actually make this both viable and palatable.
Yeah, look, and as you said, before we move on from this, as you said, there have been sort of videos emerging of emaciated Israeli hostages filmed by their captors in Gaza. The Times this morning reports that Israel is planning a new military operation in areas where hostages are thought to be held, which they've previously avoided doing so as to not put hostages' lives at risk. Do you think there is a new calculation emerging inside the Israeli government, inside the IDF, that is going to sort of place less priority on whether it's basically giving up on the idea of getting hostages back, and it's simply going to sort of pursue the other goal of eradicating Hamas to the extent that it's possible?
Well, both the Americans and the Israeli negotiators walked away from the most recent conversations around a ceasefire with Hamas because Hamas was, in their view, making unreasonable demands and refusing to commit to disarmament and the fulsome release of the hostages. And I think it's quite clear from the American side, and certainly from Netanyahu himself, that the patience for these sort of staged processes of hostage release has just sort of ended now. So they're really being quite clear on this, that they are not going to do any of those kind of partial hostage release situations again. They want everything, everyone back, all the remains back as well, in one fell swoop. And I think because they've moved to that position and Hamas is not yielding at all on this, there's obviously conversations going on in Israel about whether or not they should pursue military means to try and bring these people back. I think, though, it's quite clear that there's a lot of discomfort in Israeli society about this, because I don't think that anyone really there believes that this is actually going to be able to achieve its outcome, and in fact could endanger those people in the short term.
Let's move on to what's likely to be the big foreign policy story of the rest of the week, which Friday is Donald Trump's deadline for Russia to sign up to a ceasefire in Ukraine, and if not, face even more sanctions. In theory, those sanctions could target the countries that buy Russian oil. Sophia, I'm not going to claim that you have a crystal ball, but if you did have a crystal ball, what's going to happen?
Well, it's really interesting because, Donald Trump has made quite clear that he is not interested in confrontation with President Putin, and that's obviously led to, some quite spooky moments for Ukraine and its European allies. That said, it's also clear that over the last month in particular, he seems to have become more concerned about the attacks on Ukrainian civilians. And also there was the reports over the weekend that he had, per his social media posts, moved some nuclear-armed submarines to strategic locations. In defense, an act of sort of self-defense towards the Russian state after some rather provocative comments from Medvedev. So I think, we're seeing a little bit more of a complex picture there. That said, President Putin hasn't come to the negotiating table on a ceasefire thus far because he does not assess President Trump's threats to be credible. He does not believe that Trump wants to confront Russia or sort of fundamentally penalize it with any kind of real teeth. So that's why he hasn't been playing ball thus far. I think if Trump really wants to achieve this outcome, he is going to have to show that he means business. And that might mean a sort of, first strike in a way of sanctions applications to show that he would be willing to do it. It's quite interesting if you compare this to the trade war approach that he's been taking even with allies, which is a slap on the tariffs and then say you can negotiate to bring them down. He hasn't pursued anything like that with President Putin. So that is one approach that we could see coming up. But I do think he will do whatever it takes to try and, keep this as a live diplomatic process, only insofar as, he also is aware that his base is not particularly interested in Ukraine. I think he doesn't want to expend an enormous amount of political capital on this.
I mean, the idea of putting sanctions on countries that are buying Russian oil, that means India, that means China, that has sort of great geopolitical implications beyond directly what it means for Russia. Do you think he really has the stomach to do that?
Yes, well, I think some people have actually been quite struck by the approach he's been taking with the trade negotiations towards India, because India, of course, Prime Minister Modi, he, and Trump had a very close relationship. And it was sort of thought when he came back into office that India would be one of the sort of favored allies. But of course, they're getting hit pretty hard by these efforts to really crack down on, I suppose, alternative providers and supply chains from China. So where countries are sort of, and companies are sending different parts of their manufacturing supply chains or goods and so on, they're diverting that through other countries, Southeast Asia and so on, to avoid being scrutinized or hit with the sanctions and export controls around Chinese trade. So they've sort of fallen in the crosshairs of that. So I think in a way, he's shown that he's not afraid of playing hardball with regards to trade, even with his own allies.
Thank you very much indeed. That's Sophia Gaston there of King's College London. Great to speak to you there.